Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our special library and information podcast, Read with Some Spine with Kathleen Noonan. This has been a very special week for libraries in the City of Logan, with activities happening everywhere. And it's also worth noting that it's Under Eights Week and Reconciliation Week. So we started the week with 3 magnificent Mem Fox events at the Logan Entertainment Centre. About 1,800 people came to those events. We also had a very popular Queensland Writers Centre workshop here on Tuesday night. And on the weekend, we'll have Dale Chapman, who's quite a high-profile Indigenous chef from the Sunshine Coast. And she'll be doing a bush tucker event at Logan Hyperdome Library and also at Logan Central Library. However, tonight we have social commentator Kathleen Noonan for a conversation on what books mean to us. Do they keep us sane in a changing world? Have we changed what we read? And are libraries obsolete? Now, to introduce Kathleen. I know many of you do know Kathleen through her columns in the newspapers. Kathleen is a journalist and columnist with a long-standing interest in what makes a society fair for everyone. She writes a weekly column, Last Word, in Saturday's Courier Mail, which has appeared in newspapers throughout Australia. Her weekly column explores everything from love, death, books, running, music, poetry, refugees and chooks. Anything really. Kathleen is also on the committee of Second Chance, the only charity in Australia that raises money exclusively for homeless women. It also helps fund the work of Queensland's domestic violence shelters. Kathleen is one of 5 sisters and a brother and has 2 daughters. And with no further ado, I hand over to Kathleen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Deborah. I was driving down here tonight and I thought I'd left plenty of time, and I'm on the freeway and it's a gridlock, and I'm thinking, oh, right, what exit do I have to get off on? Do I remember the way? And, by the time I walked in the doors, your shoulders are up near your ears, and you're so tense, you're like fencing wire. And then immediately when I come into a library, and it's any library in the world, I find that I remember that place, that feeling, and your shoulders drop and you take a breath and your breathing changes. And for me, that's been the same from the very first time that I went into a library, which would have been the old 2-storey timber School of Arts library in Mackay, when Mum used to come into town with all of us in the old Valiant, not 6 kids, my brother would have stayed on the farm, and the 5 girls would have come into town, and she would have dropped us at the library and she would have gone to do her shopping. And it was going into that space where you could pick any book, any book. You were in the children's section, but really you could pick any book you liked. Mum wasn't there. And that experience and that idea that the whole world was open to you. And when you're in regional Australia and you're on a farm, we were brought up on a cattle and sugarcane, to know that the horizons were out there was amazing. And that came to me through this old School of Arts library. And of course, books come to a lot of us from our parents, being read to. I have, when you're in a big family, and I was the youngest, I have distinct memories of my mother reading to me, that idea of an adult taking the time out and giving you attention, that one-on-one attention, because I think the world is just so busy, whether it's today or back then, that there's something that just connects with the child. And I think when books are at the centre of that, I think you end up having that connection for life. To start with, I'd like to take you back to North Queensland and the farm, because at the end of last year, I had gone up to the farm, and it was the end of a day, and I'd spent there, and it was come on to dusk, and at dusk it's beer time, and so we're out on the back cement and we had sort of pushed off our boots, and my father and I, we were just sitting there having a chat, and the old Rex, the cattle dog, was sitting there as well, and we were just taking it easy. You could hear sort of the animals on the farm settling down, and my phone rang, and I answered it, and it was this beautiful, deep, recognisable voice, and it was, it's Geoffrey Rush. Am I disturbing you at all? And yeah, sure, just ring back later, will you? And it just seems so incongruous. You know, I was in the middle of nowhere. I had been organising a raffle for Second Chance, and we had asked 40 different Australians if they would choose a book. It was called the Home to Me raffle, to choose a book that made them feel safe, made them feel at home, or made them feel connected to this world at some stage in their life, and to choose the book and to write in it why and to donate it to our raffle. And they did. Everyone who we approached did. They really loved the project. And he said, I'm just back from overseas. I've just got your email, and I want to send this particular book, but I've pulled it off the bookcase, and it's falling to bits, and I've got tape here, and I'm taping it up, and you know, maybe I'll go and buy a new one. Do you want this old thing? I mean, it was the book that made me be an actor. You know, in 1972, he got it from a second-hand store, and I mean that's when he was with Queensland Theatre Company. He was going out to regional hours. It was his first year of acting, and it was a book called Arthur Koestler's The Act of Creation, and it was really a very sort of dense little tome, and it said it's a study of processes of discovery, invention, imagination and creativity in humour, science and the arts. It was sort of the how to be creative. And he said this book meant the world to me. It impelled me to belong somehow in a creative life. And he said, would it be all right? Otherwise, no. And I said, no, that would be perfect, please. And he wrote in it and he sent it to us. And we were selling tickets for the Home to Me raffle at the Brisbane Writers' Festival. And people wanted to touch this book and see this book and read the words and hold it in their hands and take photos and put it on Instagram. And I thought, wow, that is the power of the physical book, of ink and paper. Now, I got off the phone, I was a little excited. My father said, who was that? And I said, Geoffrey Rush. And he said, who's that? And my father doesn't go to the movies, so the last movie he probably saw was like The Guns of Navarone or something. So I said, he's an actor. And then we went back to talking about important things like sugar prices and the weather, very important. But the book arrived and it was just delightful. That raffle was really interesting for me because the choices of people that they sent in were really, a lot of them were connections back to home and back to parents. William McGuinness chose Jane Austen's Persuasion. I would never have picked that, you know. And he said it was a book his mother loved and read. Judith Lucy chose Tim Winton's Cloud Street. And she said, and her adopted mother, when she met her, bought the book for her and gave it to her. And she said when she read it, she realised it's the story of this big saga, this dysfunctional family that somehow is functional and with all its quirks. And she said it made me think, this woman who carried me for 9 months, she does understand me in some way. She does understand what, you know, about families. And so that was a real connection for her. The artist Ben Quilty sent and couldn't find the copy of the book that he wanted. It was out of print, and so he searched around and he found a book, and it was called The Quinkins. I don't know if anyone knows it. It was a picture book. Yeah, and it was the authors were Dick Ruffsey and Percy Resice, and his parents, when they were growing up, took the kids out of school and took them around Australia on a big trip and sort of homeschooled them while they were going around and took them to a lot of Indigenous communities as well. So this was a book that had a lot of sort of Indigenous story and pictures in it. But when you look at this children's picture book, it is so colourful and dynamic. I can just imagine a young Ben Quilty looking at it, and the seeds of his painting today are there in that book from when he was, you know, so young. So it is very telling what people send to you. Maggie Beers chose the complete poems and songs of Robert Burns. And when her assistant emailed and said this is what she'll be choosing, I thought, I wonder if it's a connection to Mother, because it's an older book, and she wrote in it that the choice came from childhood. And it was one of only 2 books that survived the time when she was about 14 and her parents became bankrupt. And they had to leave home and they lost everything else. They walked out and Mum had 2 books. And the book of Robert Burns' poetry was one of the books. And, I just cried when I read that inscription. It's just, that has travelled all her life with her, that book. So she sent us a new copy of that, which I thought was just beautiful. That's what the physical book still is to people today. I could have put that raffle together very easily using ebooks. People could have emailed me 40 names and I could have put the books together, but it wouldn't have sold tickets. People want to see and feel and see the people's signature on them and see the dog-eared pages and really make a connection. So I think, for now, the ink and the paper, it's not going anywhere in a hurry. I've been a journalist for 30 years and a columnist for 13 this month, and you get a lot of emails and a lot of letters from people all over. I got one this week from a man in LA about a column I wrote about my greyhound dying. So it obviously got on a greyhound site and forum that's gone all over, so it was just beautiful. He was sending me some poetry about dogs. So that's sort of some of the feedback that you get. But one of the emails I received was a young bloke called Solo, and he was out in central Queensland. He's working in an abattoir. He was an abattoir worker, and he, as a small kid, he'd been called Solo because he used to wander off by himself all the time. And he talked about what abattoir work was like, and it's hard. It's hard and it can be dangerous. You can see, people with near misses, and often your work colleagues, it's English as a second language. So there's boundaries or limitations that you can have in that work. And he was a reader. And he used to disguise his reading because it was just a lot more acceptable to be reading pig hunting magazines called Bustin' Bacon. So he used to hide his books under the Bustin' Bacon magazines in his car. But he used to read Faulkner, and he read Tim Winton, and he was a really quite a wide reader. And I had sort of said, where did this come from? And he said, as a small boy, his father, who was a drinker, used to take him into town and drop him at the library, and then Dad would go to the pub. And, Dad did something right there. He dropped him at the library. And so Solo was in the library for hours, and that was a good place to be. He realised that there was a whole world open to him. So after being an abattoir worker, he went on a prawn trawler, where he said they worked very hard and he smoked lots of pot. And then he was, worked in jobs all over, fruit picker, cane carter, all over. But he always had this love of reading. And therefore, was intellectually starved. If you're someone who loves reading, you're not using that in your work. And when he finally emailed, at the end of his email, he said he was in his 3rd year of his Bachelor of Education. And he was looking forward to getting out and teaching, and he particularly wanted to work with and teach sort of teenage boys, those difficult ones to work with. And he said, I really want to teach, I'll be able to teach them all about Tim Winton and Jane Austen and Harry Potter and how to skin a roo and how to gut a carcass. And he said, do you reckon they'll test that at NAPLAN? And I thought, that is, you never know. You've got kids in your library after school, or you're a volunteer page turner or a reader to small children in a library, and you just never know where that's going to lead. That I think nothing is wasted on children, that time that you put into them. Solo sticks with me a great deal. it's been interesting in the public sphere in southeast Queensland and in Queensland. There's a lot of talk about world-class cities and what makes a world-class city. And Brisbane is going to be a world-class city. If we ever get a mega casino, we're going to be a world-class city. That seems to be essential to us moving into that thing. And I always think libraries say a lot about cities. Before the State Library was done up, it was really hard to find, and it was really hard to find its front door, and it didn't really say that we thought much about books at all in Brisbane when it comes to the State Library. So it's wonderful that it's got such a beautiful building to be in now. It's strange what people talk about when they talk about world-class cities. If according to the state government, we're going to have a huge casino put in the middle of the CBD. The last figure I saw was 2,400 pokies. I think is quite extraordinary. That's to be explored. I just find that amazing. But anyway, when I explored the idea of world-class city, I went back and looked at there was a Forbes magazine did a big survey in the States, and it asked leading CEOs, investment bankers, professors at the different universities, what they needed in a city to class it as a world-class city. And I think it's really interesting to recap because it was illuminating to me. It was things that I hadn't really thought about. There were things like churches, a body of water, a river or a bay, good architecture, libraries, public parks and piazzas. The writer Lionel Shriver, who I love, she's so practical, she says affordable, extensive public transport, good libraries, generous parks, availability of public toilets. Yeah, I just love it. Others on the list said one newspaper that won't go broke within 3 years, so I'm all in favour of that. Public transport that doesn't involve people throwing up on you or rats, that's a good one, yes. Again, libraries came up again in a number of the answers. Okay, with a University of Chicago professor of law, Richard Epstein, he says that the capacity for new entrants to take root, which means a viable housing market. I think that's really interesting for us to think about in Brisbane, whether that's possible. Former investment banker Michael Thomas says you need old people, young people, rich people, poor people, gays, straights, bis, trannies, everybody. You need luxury, you need affordability, you need great universities. I think there's a really interesting take on it. I'd argue that a world-class city needs to reflect uniquely what it is. Brisbane's a young subtropical city and it should reflect that. And I think nowhere on that list did anyone say you need a casino. I thought that was really interesting. A lot of people said you need libraries, So I think that's where our millions should be spent, definitely. Personally, what books have meant to me over the years, I guess when you come up reading as a child and you read all your life, it's as normal as sunshine, isn't it? It's just you take it for granted. And I guess I took it for granted until I had my own children. And then you've got to make some really definite choices about how important you're going to make books in their lives so that they have the pleasure of it feeling as normal as sunshine as well. And I used to always link the visit to the library, and like there are days as a mother when you're feeling like a really lousy mother. You are really not feeling on top of your game at all. But I always felt that if on those days we had gone to the library, which was next to the park, and we'd taken something for a picnic, I'm a good mother that day. I'm a really good mother. The library was a wonderful place to go. There was toddler time, and there's storytelling, and who can be in a bad mood when that's going on? And your children just change. Their moods change when you take them into those public spaces. So libraries were really important to me during that time. I've always sort of built books into our lives, and you don't have to have a lot of money to do that when you've got libraries. Anyone can do it. I'm a bully. I sort of limit digital devices right through my children's childhood. They're 21 now and 17, and even now I still say, no devices in bedrooms, no devices at the dining room table. you lose all your communication skills if you're spending all your time on devices. And I'm not anti-devices. I do so much of my research and my work on the internet, but I think you need to really have that balance. So books for me have been an escape. They're travel. They're a university. They make life manageable and meaningful when you read something. And they tell you you're not alone. I find this really interesting. I find it fascinating when I'm reading a book that's 100 years old or that's been translated from a Polish writer. And I read a paragraph or a sentence and I think, that is exactly how I feel right now. Or that's exactly what I'm going through right now. And I think, wow, like it's come to you across all those times. It's come to you across the world. Which tells us that, human beings, and that's why it builds empathy in people, but also it builds, we can have a little bit more empathy for ourselves, because we read about what people do in novels. They make mistakes, they're flawed, and we forgive them. We read characters in novels and, they're really quite flawed, but we forgive them and we love them anyway. And I think that really teaches us about ourselves, because we're all this big messy mix of, of noble acts and shabby deeds and things we haven't done very well. But I think it teaches us that that everyone is. Across the ages, we always have been. But you just get up the next day to strive a little bit harder. The other thing for me that books are is, to me, books are grenades that don't go off in our faces. And by that I mean there's a lot of conversations, whether they be national conversations that we need to have as a country, as a society, or whether they're conversations we're having with partners or with friends. And we've all got some topics that are quite radioactive. It might be money. It might be, the way we communicate. On a national scale, it might be, asylum seekers. It might be sort of same-sex marriage. The kind of conversations we can't have without them just flaring and blowing up, and there's no nuanced or complexities with them. So if I read about subjects that would be inflammatory if I was going to be talking about them with people in my life, but if I read about them in a book, the book can actually take apart that grenade and look at it from different angles and say, oh, what about this? And have you thought about that? And it doesn't go off in our face. It doesn't blow off. It loses its radioactivity. To me, it loses the heat, but it's illuminating. It's still got the light. And I just think that is just some sort of miracle. I really do. I've just finished reading a very big book, which is A Little Life. So it's written by a Korean US writer, shortlisted for a number of major awards, got raved about in the New York Times, about four male friends in New York and their lives. And it's been controversial. People either hate it or they love it. One of the characters at the centre of the story has had great suffering in his life. And there's been abuse, child abuse, and it unpacks that, and you keep reading, and you're not it doesn't completely overwhelm you as a subject, and I think there's a great marvel in that, and. I've got a friend in my life, someone I know, a man who suffered terrible child abuse, and then he sort of made some choices later in his life as an adult, which I would think were sort of self-harming, and I could never understand those choices, and I could never understand the way he dealt with the whole thing. In reading that novel, I learnt exactly why he did the things he did. It was so, by the end of it, I thought, right, I understand now, I get it. I couldn't really probably have had those conversations with him. It's too radioactive, it's too hard. But there it was in a novel, and it was so well written that it was the grenade that didn't go off. It allowed me to understand. So I think that's, wow, that's just what a great gift as a novelist. Other favourite books, I've usually got a couple of books going at once. I don't know if other people do this. I have it on the bedside table because you have to read in bed. That's a given, as well as other places, or the bath. But I have a couple of books going, and one might be sort of a heavy book like that, and then another book might be a non-fiction. And another book might be a sort of book of poetry. So depending on your mood, you might dip into one or dip into the other, or give yourself a bit of a spell. And so I've also, just in the last couple of months, read a crime fiction called The Whites by Richard Price. And The Whites, the title comes from sort of the Moby Dick idea of the whites is the white whale that got away. So it's a crime novel about policemen, and they've all got one case of one criminal that got away from them. And they all want to get that guy. And some of them start to turn up dead. So it's very much in the police world, and it's got a lot of sort of you really sort of have to get your ear toned into the police talk, but it's fantastic. And I'm not someone who would think I'm a great reader of crime fiction, but this has just been tremendous. So I've been sort of slotting that in between sort of other books. And the other one I've been sort of reading there, which is a non-fiction, is Gloria Steinem's latest book, the activist and feminist and activist in the US, and her latest book is called My Life on the Road, and it's been a wonderful read because I started expecting one thing, and it's actually delivered so much more. It's got all this unexpected material as well. She writes beautifully about her father, and it's got so many delightful surprises. I think that's a really lovely thing in a book too, if you get surprises from it. And in fact, I've heard myself in different conversations, I did it today with Deborah, in saying, we're talking about something completely different, and I'll say, well, Gloria Steinem said. Lots of little ideas that are nothing to do with feminism or activism or anything else, but they're bits of wisdom. There's clever, but I think her book is wise. There are lots of bits of wisdom in it. I'm often asked, what are your favourite books? And, that's like asking, what are your favourite children? And one of my daughters always says, there are favourites, Mum. You know it's me. She's a shocker. But I have to say, I've got an all-time favourite, and it's a Tim Winton book. And I love Tim Winton because I guess I'm from regional Australia, and I love the way he writes about regional Australia and about landscape and nature. They're always very much embedded in that. And I think he gets the Australian vernacular done really well. And it's not one of his big books. It was an early one, and it's called The Riders. And it was a strange tale about a father and his small daughter, and the mother disappears. And then he's chasing her. She's the elusive. She's like the white whale. And I cannot explain to you why it is my favourite book. I think that's also good. It was the right book for me at the right time. There's a bit of magic in it. A lot of it divided his readers, his fans. Some of them hated it. There was an ambiguous ending. There is an ambiguous ending, and a lot of people don't like that in their books. And for some reason, it's a book. I go back to it every couple of years, and I read it. It's wonderful. In the past 12 months, I have to say I had a non-reader in my life. I got married and then discovered my husband was a non-reader. I don't know if I would have married if I knew that originally, but no. And so he would fall asleep while trying to read at night. And so he just would never get past the first 10 pages of any book, and never have a chance to get into the book. And some books you actually, sometimes it's really hard. The first 30 pages, you're thinking, I'm not getting anywhere here. And then suddenly you're into the book and it's good. So he would not get anywhere. And so I really had to hone my skills at choosing books, and I was determined I was going to try and get him in. And so I started with sort of slim little sort of Raymond Chandler or Carver or Richard Ford. So I was thinking along the male lines. I was really sort of looking for books that were, he was saying, has this got any sex, drugs or rock and roll in it? And I would say, yes, it has, Just keep reading, it's there. And you know, I threw Tim Winton at him as well. So the wonderful thing that did for me was it you know, I purposely was going into that world and looking for books that males would enjoy. I think males do read differently to women. I wish all books just had the initials of the author on them, not the first name and the surname, because women read books written by men and women. Men, for the most part, don't read books written by women. And you know, lots of studies have been done on that. So I think you should always publish, you know, with initials only. So we have no idea who we're really reading. But in that time, I picked up for him a book by John Williams. Now, John Williams' name has come up in the last 12 months as sort of, everyone was talking about this forgotten classic called Stoner. And they were saying, oh, it's the sort of book, it's the most fantastic book you've never read. And it was coming out of the US, and the New York Times was writing about it, and John Williams was sort of this genius. And it is a good book, and I've read it. But then I went back and read his other book from that time, which was called Butcher's Crossing. And it's a slim book, and it's about buffaloes. It's about men going to hunt buffaloes and a young man going out into the wild to join these men to fight, to make their fortune by hunting buffaloes. Now that sounds, you know, pretty buffaloes really, but you know, it's about everything. It's about human nature. It's about vanity. It's about greed. You know, you could even read into it the idea of, you know, our connection to planet, everything that we do. You know, something happens to their souls, and in this book, and the whole the Butcher's Crossing is this little sort of little town from when they went out to do the hunting, and the idea, I guess, what I got from it was when you come back, can you cross over again, back into the land of the living after you've been doing so much killing. So, you know, this was this great book, and so I recommend it to a lot of people, but they say what it's about, and I say it's about killing buffaloes. So, you know, I'm obviously not selling it very well at all. And another book which I have had with me and close by on my bedside table for a long time now is a poetry collection, and people hear the word poetry and they can really you know, click off. I loved poetry through school. Then I sort of didn't read a lot of poetry through my 20s or 30s, I guess, but I was given this book. It's called so there's a trilogy. It's called Staying Alive, and then there's Being Alive and Being Human. Staying Alive was put together. It's 500 life-affirming poems. They're not dense poems that push you away. They're actually poems that allow anyone to read them. They're not flowery. And it was published by a small publishing firm in the UK, and then it just had a cult following, and it was one of the best-selling books of the year in the UK when it was published. And so it's put together by a writer called Neil Astley, made the choices, and it's just one of those great books to have, where it's the end of a long day and you're thinking, oh, you know, you're trying to switch down from everything you've done in the day, and sometimes I just read one or two poems, and to be able to go to sleep with just good words rolling around in your head, bouncing your neurons, instead of, you know, going to sleep thinking about your mortgage or, you know, all the things you've done wrong in the day, you know, all the people you've failed or things you haven't lived up to or whatever it is. So that book's been a real journeyman for me, and I absolutely I love it, and I've recommended it to a lot of people. You know, other books that I particularly try and choose books that would appeal to a really broad audience. So in the last sort of 12 months as well, there's been authors like Philip Meyer is an author of a book called The Sun, which is a big book, which sort of which which sort of plats together a number of stories. But when I had a look at it and I was thinking, how will I describe this book? It's also about buffaloes. Obviously I'm on a buffalo thing at the moment, but it's about, American Indians and their culture and their way of life, and it is just extraordinary. It's really a quite extraordinary book. So, yes, that's a wonderful one as well. People often ask about how the internet has changed our reading patterns and how it's going to be changing the reading patterns for our children. And I'd have to say, I know that when I'm going through my research, and I read papers in physical form and I read newspapers online as well, and I read a lot of, I have subscription, online as well as digital, and you are bombarded with information online. You really are, and you take in so much information by osmosis almost. But for me, it's kind of like fast food. It's not nurturing. You don't sort of feel satisfied after you've read a lot of it, and not in the way that you do when you sit down and to read a book. You read a novel, and I always think that reading a novel is like putting down a taproot. You really have to go, that feeling you get when you think, oh my goodness, what's the time? Oh, an hour's gone past. You've been in that world, you've been lost, you've put a taproot down, and you're really sort of looking at the complexities, or the story is just carrying you along. And I think that reading muscle is just like any other muscle in our body, and you have to exercise it. And I notice with my daughters, and they weren't digital natives, so they didn't have phones and they weren't on iPads from when they were little. Thank goodness we didn't have all that at that stage. But they certainly, are very connected. But I just think it's so important that you have to keep exercising that muscle. You have to have a book by your bed. A book is a go-to thing that you have. You need to have that thought where there's some higher thinking. We really need to be able to do that. We really need to be able to look at subtle and complex ideas in the way that an author does that. I think it must be hard to be a writer today. When you think about writers, they're sort of like wombats. They're just in their little cave. I mean, it takes a long time to write a book. You're an introvert. You are alone most of the time, and it takes a long time to sort of put a book out by yourself, writing at your desk. But now the modern world sort of demands that you really have to be part of the selling of that book. You have to do the tap dance. Writers' festivals, writers' events are so big, and they really do power a lot of the sales of their books. So it's very hard for writers who that doesn't come easily to. Some writers, they just flourish in that space. They are entertainers. But others are not, and I know for others it can be really difficult. I did an event with Tim Winton, who is they always say you should never meet your idol. I remember Ramona Cavell off Radio National saying, and she did thousands of interviews with writers, and she said, really, never meet your idol. She said, there's only been 2 or 3 that have really lived up to what they were for me. And I think, okay, that's really interesting. So I really didn't want to do this event with Tim Winton because I thought, no, he's just fine the way he is, Anyway, we were behind the scenes before we started, and he gets tremendous stage fright. He gets very, very nervous, and he was, he wanted to know, well, what passage will we? Well, I said, I'd like to ask you to read a passage during our talk, and he said, well, what passage is it? I'd like to go through it and make sure I get it right. He had written it, but he wanted to make sure he got it right. Now, when he came out on stage, he has wonderful, profound things to say. You would never guess that. But it doesn't come easily to all writers. And he's done a lot of public things simply because it has enhanced his environmental work that he does. So it was to raise money for the fight for the reef over in Western Australia. So for a lot of them, they've really had to adapt. I go with my sister each year down to the Sydney Writers' Festival, and it's really wonderful for two reasons. She's a teacher, and she doesn't live in Brisbane. So, for one, it's feeding your hinterland, because I think no matter what job we have, you talk to the same people, whether it be teachers or whether it be journalists. We talk to the same, so journalists talk to journalists, teachers talk to teachers. We read the same things, we do the same things every day, and you really need to have this sort of creative things coming from all over to feed your hinterland. Your hinterland is lots of other things that make you interesting as a person, make you an interesting teacher, and make you an interesting journalist. You've got to have all this other input, which you don't think it directly actually affects your job, but it does. And, is your topsoil, not being fertilised well, and you're feeling a bit flat, and you're feeling a bit, lean pickings for what you do. Sometimes I think it's because we haven't taken care or nurtured our own hinterland. So I say to my sister, all we're doing is looking after our hinterland. Surely that's part of the personal development budget at your school. And so we organise a trip down to Sydney for the Sydney Writers' Festival. The other thing it does is it gives her and I time together, which is just a luxury a luxury to do something together. But also, we're not just talking and chatting and catching up on gossip and she did this and I did that and da-da-da. We go along and we hear talks, all sorts of talks. I love writers' festivals. You don't have to be a reader to go to a writers' festival. I've got a dyslexic friend. She goes to writers' festivals because she doesn't read books, but she loves ideas. And you can hear the writers talk about ideas. And so we go along to so many talks, and we'll come out of it, and so we'll find a bar, get a drink, and we'll be talking about big ideas. We'll be talking about it'll be life, and it'll be death, or it'll be palliative care, or it'll be asylum seekers, or it'll be something about the human condition. And I think, wow, I think I've learnt more about my sister and the way her take on the world in going to the Writers' Festival with her than I would if I didn't. And I find books are a wonderful thing to have in common with friends or sisters, because if you've had a bit of a falling out, or you're a bit ratty with each other on the phone, because mine aren't here in Brisbane, and you're rubbing each other up the wrong way, after there's a bit of a lull in the conversation or whatever, you can always say, "What are you reading?" It's a safe area. And we go, "Right, okay, I'm reading this." "Oh, right, you're in that. My book club's doing this." And suddenly we're two readers talking to each other, rather than sisters. So writers' festivals are wonderful places for writers who are extroverts. But I've heard David Malouf at the Sydney Writers' Festival, and I have to say he was wonderful. I mean, he would just open his mouth and these beautifully constructed sentences would come out that were so profound. But he would say, I'll be in an audience, and I'll be about to go up, and then I'll come back down again. I'll hear someone in the row say, "He's a lot shorter and older than I imagined." And so he says, you meet the writer on the page. And I think that's really important. You meet the true writer on the page. And you don't have any expectation past that. That's the best they are. And often I try and keep that in mind. So I would like to talk a little bit about books in their form at the moment, and libraries in their form at the moment, and that whole idea of the future of libraries and books. And it's been interesting because we've sat back here in Australia and we've watched somewhere like the UK, where with all the austerity measures, they've been closing libraries everywhere. And in fact, the opponents of that have put up posters and had badges made that say, "We choose to be stupid and dumb. We choose." And I think it's really interesting. They've shut down 2 libraries in London, and an FOI, which is a Freedom of Information search, afterwards had a look, and it found that the expenses for keeping those libraries closed but guarded by security because they're in areas which, if they're looking a bit derelict or closed down, they'll get looted. The security was costing about £2,000 a day. It was costing more to keep them closed than it was to keep them opened, because people keep buildings safe, and use them. So it's a really very sad thing. But I think the idea, libraries have evolved, and they always evolve. And librarians are onto that. I mean, they've evolved incredibly. I have, great trust in librarians. There's for all sorts of reasons, in all different ways. There's a beautiful library which I'm telling myself I have to visit one day, and it's in China, and it's about an hour outside Beijing. And it was in a small village that was going very much through the doldrums because it was now out of Beijing. It was losing all its citizens into the city. And it had no visitors, had no tourists. It was in a rural area, and they were building or renovating the library there. And a really well-known architect, very sort of innovative architect, put his hand up and he said, "I'll do that building." And he made sort of this steel and glass box, very simple, but it was in an area where there was lots of fruit trees and chestnut trees and all surrounded by forests of his trees. So he decided to clad the outside of the building with branches of the fruit trees. So all on the outside of this building, and you can Google it, and there's lots of images of it online, and it's got, all the light comes through these branches. So inside the space is this beautiful sort of slatted light. It's got no power source, so it's closed by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It's all natural light. It shouldn't work as a library at all. It's got no heating. It's got no cooling. It's got natural sort of heating and cooling. It's not even a lending library. It's a library you can go and read at, and you can go along and donate books. You can put a couple of books in the library. It is simply a space for people to read, be calm, meditate. Now, that library gets, from the city of Beijing, they've had to put on more public transport in buses and trains because it gets 200 visitors a day at least. Because it is a beautiful space, because it is a place to contemplate, and so it's revived the village. They've put in restaurants, they've got staff working there now, and also every 5 years you have these branches all sort of get ratty and deteriorate. So he very much said to all the villagers, "I need you every 5 years. We need to reclad and do it all again." So to start with, the villagers were like really, they were very cynical about the whole idea and suspicious of it, and now they own it. They own this library because it's brought prosperity, because it's a part of what they do. So I think it's really interesting because it was all about, it belonged to that space, and it reflected people in the village. It reflected its space. And I think libraries, no matter where they are, and even if they're part of a big system, every library is going to be different, and every library reflects the community that it's in, and to me that's really the future. At the very heart of why I feel passionate about libraries, they're about the only thing in the world that I would chain myself in front of or lie down in front of a bulldozer, but I would, and it's because it all comes back to me about a fairer society, because I remember being in a library one day with my children when they were small, and libraries are nothing to do with consumerism. They're nothing to do with capitalism. There's very few spaces in the world today that are like that. We have shopping centres, we have casinos, we have so much of our public space is turned into commercial space. So to me, libraries are somewhere where people can go without spending a cent. And you can go to a library. When you go to those other spaces, when you go to a shopping centre, after a couple of hours shopping, I always feel really ratty, and you're never rich enough, are you? You're never rich enough. You never can have all the things you want to have. I can go to a library, my girls can go to a library, we can get 20 books each, we feel rich. You walk out of there feeling like $1 million. I was in the library this day with my girls. There was a woman at the counter in front of us with her children. She was from Ethiopia. I heard her speaking earlier. They were arranging a library card for her. She had bought all the information she needed, and they were explaining to her how you would use a library card, and gave the children their library cards. And they were saying, now you can take out 20 books each. And the woman said, how much do I need to pay? And the librarian said, it's for free. And she was explaining to her children. She said, no, how much will I need to pay? No, it's for free you get these books. And she just turned to her children, and the expression was, what kind of country have we come to? It was like, I don't think I've ever felt prouder of being an Australian. That is the Australia, that's the egalitarian society that I want to live in, that we actually choose that it's inclusive, and we want our people to be smarter and to be readers. So that's basically why I love libraries.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you for joining us tonight and bringing real meaning to celebrating Library and Information Week. We've been on an odyssey through literature, big ideas, dangerous ideas, and some of the fabulous famous people, but also some of the really everyday normal people, or not so normal people, like Solo. I love that story about Solo. And I think we all here in this room share some of those stories. And I just, on behalf of Logan City Council Libraries, thank you.